wanted to make a short video on the topic of tolerance and intolerance as it applies to libertarian thought, as I've seen over the past few years, and again recently, a number of libertarians misunderstand the issue, or at least misrepresent it. It's a topic that I feel has lacked significant discussion, which in turn has led many people not to think about it and has made it an avenue into which lefties and Marxists have managed to corrupt parts of the libertarian movement. Before we can dive straight into the issue, let's define some terms first. While this may seem obvious, I did have someone tell me that tolerance is just about not being violent towards someone, which I think is a bit silly and not very useful. For our purposes here, we'll be drawing on the Cambridge definition, but we'll go on to say that to not impose costs onto someone or something is to tolerate it. So what do I mean by imposition of costs? Well, obviously physical force and violence will impose a cost on someone, but so do with more subtle things, like economic costs in the form of being banned from a store, or social costs, such as having abuse shouted at you on the street, inability to have a friendship, or to not be able to cooperate with someone, and many such things like this. Any action that lowers the overall utility of another, not just in monetary terms, but overall, is an imposition of a cost. This definition isn't meant to be an exercise in sophistry, but what I think to be an accurate description of how the terms are being used and the actual consequences of them. Intolerance is then obviously the inverse of this, the deliberate imposition of costs onto another individual or group for whatever reason. Note, however, that this does not mean that the use of force is being used against them. Discrimination is just one of the forms intolerance can take, but if we define association as a prerequisite for cooperation, then disassociation can also be a form of cost imposition or intolerance. So what then is the problem as I see it? Currently, one of the popular ways to describe or introduce libertarianism to newcomers is via mottos like "to live and let live," which is the current motto for Liberland, and a few other things, and to generally sell the ideology as being free to do whatever you want. This is a conflation of libertarianism and libertinism, and it's not just misleading, I think it's just outright false. Libertarians are advertised as being tolerant of all lifestyles and peoples, so long as they don't initiate force against others, everything is fine. But if we actually consider what this statement actually means, being intolerant of activities and people by discrimination and disassociation is perfectly within an individual's rights. So we have a kind of contradiction between the presented narrative and the available freedoms of a sovereign people. The lazy explanation given by libertarians comes in the form of a sort of hand-waving about, these people, these activities aren't hurting you, therefore we should all be cultural libertarians, for lack of a better term, although libertine is a pretty good fit, I think. But this argument isn't actually based in any logic. It demands that we give up our freedoms to appease the wants of others. It ignores the full range of cost imposition caused by certain activities, and denies us the ability to pursue our subjective, but otherwise perfectly legitimate, social aesthetic preferences. What happens then if we unleash the totalities of freedoms to discrimination and disassociation? For starters, this is, or at least it should be, the default position for libertarianism. Any libertarian who supports cultural libertarianism or anti-discrimination laws is drawing from other values and beliefs beyond self-ownership or individual sovereignty. As already discussed, it's perfectly valid to discriminate and disassociate from any individual for any reason. Similarly, one can do this against any class of people, or for any group that engages in certain behaviours. For example, a racist may ban all blacks from his store, call them slurs in public, refuse to cooperate with them, or otherwise impose costs upon them that would be perfectly fine with libertarian ethics. However, it's unlikely that the others in the rest of society would agree with or even appreciate this discrimination. Hence, indirectly, the racist is imposing a social cost onto them of sorts, as their aesthetic preferences are no longer being realised. In turn, then, will the others in society discriminate and disassociate from the racist, imposing costs that make such behaviour undesirable, forcing him to either conform to the established social norms or be exiled from that society and have to move to one where racism is a social norm there. In the aggregate, then, it can be easily seen that individual preferences of each citizen and the actions they make in discriminating and associating with different things and people make up a complex network, much like the goods and services do in a market. Hence we can describe this sort of marketplace not of goods and services with price levels, but rather of social norms with tolerance levels.
It's all over.
In my view, such a market would care little about what people did in the privacy of their own homes, away from the rest of society, such as drug use, homosexual relations, sexual deviancy, etc., as these impose very little cost on others. However, activities done in the public view that deviate significantly from the social norms of society will be discriminated against heavily. Things such as public intoxication, pride rallies where sexual deviancy is intentionally paraded around, unwanted multiculturalism, and many other things. Overall, publicly, society would have much higher social standards and much stronger social norms. However, privately would be much liberal. Today, the state, via anti-discrimination laws, other legislation, public education, direct funding, subsidises various activities and lifestyles while suppressing others, artificially distorting the market for social norms. In my view, this is why society has become so progressive, for lack of a better term, over the last half-century or so, and it's a major contributing factor to many of the social issues we have today because it undermines social cohesion. The imposition of social costs is higher than the equilibrium level that it should be at. Libertarians, I think, need to start accepting these facts and arguments of this marketplace of social norms into everyday debates, or otherwise they risk turning the movement into sort of another front for the Marxist left to push progressive politics and various identity politics, etc. If people don't have property rights associated with their own body, then what hope is there for the rest of property rights?